All right. Last week, we discussed the difference between the wise man and the foolish man from Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and how that Solomon is observing when it comes to the pursuits of the mortal life. Again, all of this is from a perspective of physical man, and especially in the context of just our sphere of experience. Okay, this is not including spiritual thoughts and concerns or pursuits concerning God and getting to heaven. This is just specifically about man. So when he describes in verse 14 that the wise man's eyes are in his head, that represents an understanding, an ability to apply wisdom to understand his path, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceive myself that the same event happens to them all. And this is the alluding to ultimately death, that man is mortal, and it doesn't matter how wise you are, it doesn't matter how foolish you are, death is going to come for you one way or the other. And that's just a course of life. In verse 15, he said, "So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, and how does a wise man die? As the fool." He's not saying here in verse 15 that the pursuit of wisdom is vanity. He's saying that the state of being wise, to think that that is going to help you somehow avoid death, certainly there's application of wisdom, of godly wisdom, in that you will not be engaging in activities like drugs and alcohol and things that could speed your death along, so to speak. That's not to say that that application doesn't exist. But what he's describing here is that just the state of being wise doesn't help you in any way from preventing death. That simply isn't the way it works. And so in verse 16, he's really, especially these first couple of chapters, he's kind of preoccupied with this idea of remembrance. And we spoke a little bit about this last week, in that even though we don't talk about it a lot, in the end, one of man's, I guess at his core, one of our biggest fears is to be forgotten. And death, certainly we're afraid of. Things happening to us or to our loved ones, we're afraid of those things. But when it comes to our legacy, things that will be left behind when we die, the idea of being remembered is a very important thought process. And especially, I imagine, the older we get, that probably becomes more and more important to us. And this is something that seems to resonate with Solomon, and the fact that no matter how rich you are, no matter how wise you are, no matter how powerful you are, one day you're going to be forgotten. All your works are going to... We remember the name of Solomon because God has kept it, that remembrance alive in his word. But regarding many of the specific works that Solomon did, maybe some of the specific applications of his wisdom, aside from the two women and the one baby example, a lot of those have been lost to time. So even though we know of Solomon and we have a general picture of his life, there's a lot that has been forgotten. And he was the wisest man that ever lived. So in verse 16, he says, "There is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, how does a wise man die? As the fool." Which is to say, yes, there is the existence of the fact that death is going to take place to both of them. But in specific context to the memory of the generations that come after. That you would think logic would dictate that the fools would die in relative obscurity, that they would not, and their mistakes would not be remembered. Whereas the wise and people who represent good examples, that they would be remembered for generations to come. But that's not the case. And unless God has preserved it, for instance, they're forgotten. Their works are forgotten. Their mistakes and their successes are forgotten. And so this is part of this vanity that Solomon has been observing. Anything through so far through verse 16? Verse 17, "Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind." he doesn't, this isn't to say that Solomon is depressed in the sense that he hated life and didn't want to live anymore or something like that. That's not what he's expressing. He recognized the injustice of the physical, mortal state of man. That's what he's observing. And he's not blaming God or anything like that. He's simply observing that man on his own, in his mortal state, life, at least the traditional things that man seeks in life, outside of God, none of it matters. Because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. Because it's all vanity. It's all grasping for the wind. None of it's going to last. None of it's going to be remembered. So what's the point? And that's kind of what the conclusion he's coming to here regarding the physical state of man. He says it's all vanity and grasping for the wind. And then verse 18, when he considers earlier in chapter 2, he details a lot of the works he did and a lot of the things he sought to pursue with regard to the pleasures of this life and so forth. He says in verse 18, I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. The description of hating all of his labor, it's not that he didn't take pleasure in it at the time. And again, particularly, we're discussing the non-sinful element of what he enjoyed. He described that earlier in chapter 2. That he'll even acknowledge later on in Ecclesiastes that part of the gift of God is to enjoy the work of your hands. Okay, the labor and the reward you gain from that labor, enjoy it. Because this is what God has given you. And certainly that is also emphasized in 1 Timothy chapter 6 with regard to those who love money or have a love for money and being root of all evil. Within that context in chapter 6, he goes on to describe how that God has given us these things. You know, God has blessed us with these things. We should be willing to share, certainly, but also he's given us all things to enjoy. And as a result, there's a recognition from Solomon here that really what boils down to is I hated it in that it's not going to last. And when I die, someone else is going to come along and they may be the complete opposite of me. They may be a fool and run the kingdom into the ground, so to speak. In verse 20, he says, therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill. Yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. When he says it's a great evil, he's not associating this with some sort of sin. It's the characteristic of the physical state of man that he considers this to be great evil. In that, from a human perspective, it's not fair. From a human perspective, it's not the way things should work. And certainly, I think all of us can probably appreciate that. And so that's what he says when he says this is a great evil. It's not that sin is associated with it necessarily, but the fact that this isn't fair in the context of all the work a person puts in to build something up for someone just to come along with no skill. He didn't work for it. He just inherited it, and then he abuses it. What was the point then? Nolan?
A couple of passages just come to mind. The first one with Jesus' story about a young man who tore down his barns to build bigger ones.
Yeah.
It's kind of come into play here.
Yeah.
Paul's writing to Timothy, 1 Timothy 6, don't put your trust in these uncertain riches.
Right.
God has given us all things to enjoy.
Right.
You said he's going to point out here at the time it's happening, but the tipping point, putting your trust in it, or that it's going to last, or that that's where.
Right. And, you think about that man who had this, huge storage of grain and food, and, it was full, and he said to himself, well, I'll build an even bigger one and keep storing it up. It seemed like the lesson there from Jesus was a condemnation. You've got more than enough for yourself and for your family, and it really seemed to be a condemnation against just storing it, not being willing to share it, not being willing to utilize the blessings of the present to help others, and instead just keep storing up as if you're going to get to take it with you. And that's certainly not the case. Verse 22, for what has a man in all of his labor? For the striving of his heart with which he has toiled under the sun. This phrase, under the sun, keeps popping up in Ecclesiastes. So keep in mind, every time we read under the sun, this is representative of the mortal life. This is not within consideration of the pursuit of God's word, the pursuit of godly wisdom, the pursuit of heaven. That is not what he's considering when he refers to the phrase under the sun. This is simply man's physical sphere of experience in this world. So what has a man for all his labor? What is the ultimate, what is the end result? What is the profit? What does he walk away with at the end of it? Nothing. And that's his point. It is that all the labor, all the striving of his heart, the work and the toil that he puts his heart into, farming, getting a master's degree, PhD, whatever, the things that we do to try to store up for retirement and so forth, by the time it's all done with, what do we walk away with? And again, there's the physical application of retirement and so forth. But he's talking about after that, especially given the fact that we all die in the end. And that whatever's left over of our quote-unquote estate, it's going to go to somebody else. It's going to go to the government. It's going to go to family. It's not going to go with us. And that's his ultimate point. Verse 23, for all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. When he says they're sorrowful, he's not saying that there is no joy to be had in life. But from a human perspective, and noticeably who is absent in this consideration, verse 23. God isn't mentioned here, is he? Okay, so if, kind of to steal a phrase from Paul, if in this life only we have hope, which is to say, and again, he was using that in context of Christ not being raised from the dead, and he never really was, so what's the point of our faith in 1 Corinthians 15? But in this life only, if we put our hope and our trust in that which is physical, and we come to the understanding that ultimately this is all for naught, then what's the point of life? What purpose is it? It really is sorrowful from a human perspective, from an under the sun perspective. Without God being a part of the equation, every day is sorrowful because we know that no matter how hard we work, how many hours we put in, how much money we set aside, none of it's going to last. None of it's ultimately important. And that certainly would be a sorrowful perspective from a mortal, fleshly perspective only. And that's really what the ultimate point that Solomon's making is. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. So what would be the antonym of what he describes here? The opposite of what he says is that in the night our hearts do take rest. Well, there's a term we use to refer to that. What is that? Contentment, or starts with a P, peace. Okay? When it comes to, think about Philippians chapter 4, okay, in verse 7, where we talk about the anxieties and our worries, verse 6, when he says, don't be anxious for anything, Paul says to the Philippians, but everything with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And then he says, and the what of God? Peace of God will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Why does that peace exist when we pray to God, we pour out our hearts, we pour out our worries and our cares? Why does that peace then come? Why does Paul say that the peace of God will guard our hearts and minds? Okay, so then you're not just, you're actually taking your cares, as Peter describes in 1 Peter chapter 5, and you're casting your cares upon him because he cares for us. Okay, it's not just, I'm going to share them with you. No, you cast them on. And as a result, now you're going to take care of what's in your control, but the vast majority of the things that we worry about day to day is stuff that is beyond our control anyway. We have no control. Why worry about it? And so the idea is recognizing that God is going to have ultimate control. God is going to be the one who's going to make sure everything works out to the way He wants it to be. It may not be the way we want it to be, but it's going to be the way God wants it to be. Then that helps us to attribute the responsibility then is God has taken that responsibility. This is within His control and not mine. And so there's peace there. But can you imagine, and I'm sure, and we all have friends and probably family members who, but day by day, they deal with this, where because maybe they don't have faith in God, they're not religious minded, day by day they worry and maybe they get ulcers, maybe they have heart issues because of all the things that they deal with, things that they're concerned about, and there is no peace. They're just kind of like what we use the phrase sometimes, toss and turn at night. And this is kind of what I think about in verse 23 when Solomon describes having that his heart takes no rest, because there is no settling. There's no peace that is enabled to the man who is only within the context of mortal fleshly existence. There's no peace. This also is vanity. Nothing man can do can secure peace. Can't do it. And that is part of what Solomon is observing under the sun. Thoughts through verse 23. Yes, sir.
Let's just again back to where you put your trust. These things are uncertain things, as Paul called it.
Yeah.
1 Timothy. You work, even if you get them, they may be gone tomorrow, they come and go, somebody steals them, the stock market crashes, whatever. Or even if you hold on to them, you die.
Yeah.
They're staying there.
Yeah. Many years ago when we had the big stock market crash, there were reports about people committing suicide and jumping out of windows and jumping off of buildings and stuff like that, because their entire life's work through just one span of a day or a week, it was all destroyed. Everything they had built up, everything they had helped others to build up was all gone when the stock market crashed. And from a human perspective, if that's where you put your trust, I can understand their feeling of complete loss. But from a spiritual perspective, when I was observing those things on the news, I just kind of shaking my head thinking, it's just money. I understand that it is important. We have to use it to support ourselves and our families and so forth, but it's just money. In the end, what difference does that make? And certainly that is what Solomon is observing here, is that you put your trust in these things, you're never going to have peace. You're never going to have rest. You're only going to have sorrow. Anything else through verse 23? Yes, sir.
So again, in the bigger picture of the book, even the money, not bad in itself. You use
Yeah.
it for its purpose for life under the sun.
Right.
But at the end of the book, he's going to take it beyond life under the sun
Yeah.
into eternity, and these things don't follow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that kind of is going to put context into the first part of chapter 3, that everything has a purpose. Okay, there is a designation for everything. And when we lose our perspective on that, that's when things become so troubling. When we forget that there's the full life experience throughout this life. There's a time for all things. And sometimes there's going to be time for earning money, and then sometimes there's going to be a time for losing money too. That's just a part of life. Verse 24, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. Now again, he has already mentioned this in context of the fact that he hated his works and the labor that he had, because he observed the unfair nature of under the sun. But now, notice who is included in verse 24. Who does he include now in verse 24? God. Now God is mentioned. So now we're coming outside of the context of under the sun without God, and now we're including God in this thought process, in this perspective. He says, nothing is better that a man enjoy, or that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. In that, within the will of what God wants us to be able to enjoy and what we know we shouldn't, he says this is a blessing from God. You put in labor, you put in work, you gain, we get a paycheck for it, and that paycheck certainly goes to pay bills, it goes to allow for things that may come along, but it also goes to things that we can enjoy, luxuries that we can enjoy. God has given us these things richly to enjoy them in the present. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's what Solomon observes, because in the end, you can enjoy it now, but one day it's all going to be gone, and what was the point of just keeping it in store? There was no point. And so that's part of what he observes, is that this is a blessing from God. Enjoy your food, enjoy your drink, enjoy the good of your labor. This is a blessing. Verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? Again, the context of Solomon and all the riches that he had, the opportunities that he had to enjoy life. Who can eat, who can have enjoyment more than I? But notice verse 26. Earlier, it was just in the context of under the sun, even from his own experience. Now, verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. He addresses how God has established things to work in this world. When he says God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, and of course, certainly Solomon there was a miraculous element to what he received from God. Okay, God gave him wisdom, but also Solomon described the fact that he also pursued wisdom. That wasn't the end of it. There was more that he gained from his life experience, from the things that he learned, and certainly our pursuit of godly wisdom and understanding how God wants us to live in this world certainly attributes itself to wisdom, knowledge, and joy. Remember, there was a lack of joy for those people whose only focus is here on this earth. But for the man who puts his focus on God, you gain wisdom and knowledge and joy. And notice he says, but to the sinner. He's already described the state of the person whose focus is only on earth. To the sinner, this is what the sinner ultimately goes for. He gives the work of gathering and collecting. There is no joy. There is no wisdom, there is no knowledge. Not ultimate wisdom and knowledge and joy. The type of wisdom, knowledge, and joy that is going to last. The sinner, the person who is only focused on under the sun, he just gathers and collects. His days are full of sorrow. His heart, there is no rest. That he may also give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So that he might give to him who is good. Okay. There is a sense in which he's describing the ultimate end of these riches and these things that the sinner attempts to collect and gather. Because notice that the association here between the wise and the fool is carried all the way through now into verse 26. He associates the one who is good in the sight of God, one who pursues righteousness, as the wise, and the one who only lives for this world as the fool. And he's already described what the end of the fool is, and how that sorrow and that lack of peace and that lack of rest is what accompanies him. And so what's going to end up happening to his things? Well, many of those things are going to be bought, invested by those who are good in the sight of God. Ultimately, those things are going to go to somebody else. And that's why he says this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Not to say that what God has established is vanity. That's not what he's applying this to. He's applying it to the work of the sinner. This is what the work of the sinner is. To gather and collect so that when he dies, it's left for someone else. This is vanity and grasping for... He's not saying that God's will is vanity. He's saying that the purpose to which he's given the sinner, that sinner's work and what they're doing in their pursuits and their thought process, their perspective on just this world, that is vanity and grasping for the wind. Anything through verse 26?
And just the flip-flop of what he said earlier about his own works that he's going to build up and leave. The one after him might be good, but he may be the fool.
Yeah.
Here's just
And just run it into the ground? Yep. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of parallels in what Solomon describes with his own experience and then applying that to all men. And really, to a certain extent, Solomon is really making the case that whether you're rich or poor, notice he doesn't grade this on a rich equals wise or vice versa, and poor equals fool or vice versa. That's not how he associates this. He associates this as wisdom being the pursuit. Okay, wisdom and knowledge and joy and associated with God. Rich, poor, that's not a part of the equation. It's simply, what does a man gain from his labor? Well, what he does gain, whether that is loads of riches like Solomon or just enough to get by each month to pay your bills. Either way, that pursuit of it and the recognition of the perspective that we should have as Christians, that is what he associates with wisdom. Whereas the person who takes that paycheck and all they do is go out and buy beer or drugs, that's foolishness. Anything else through verse 26? All right, chapter 3. So chapter 3, this first 8 verses, this is a very well-known text even by people who aren't necessarily religious. But a lot of times it really is, to some extent, taken out of context at times, especially the individual verses within it. Sometimes it's kind of just taken out. All of this is a contrast of extremes, and really, I guess by definition of what he describes, they're opposites, okay? But there's an ultimate reason why he addresses all of this. Verse 1, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And this is the same related phrases, under the sun, under heaven. It's the same concept, which is to say, on this earth. A lot of times this text gets taken to describe the idea of fate, that God has already ordained all of these things to take place, and that we're just kind of in a linear track, just going through the motions, so to speak. That's not what Solomon's describing here. He's describing that under heaven, as he observes the sphere of man's existence and his experience, this is what he experiences. There is a time to, and the Hebrew phrase here is very odd. Most Bibles translate it, there is a time to be born and a time to die, but the literal Hebrew here is there's a time to give birth and a time to die, which carries with it a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. So the idea, I don't choose to be born, but certainly there is a time in which I'm born. But more specifically, there comes a time where you must give birth. Okay, that's just simply the way it works. It's the way God's established for people, man and woman, to work. And as a result, you give birth after 9 months. That's what God has established for woman. There is a time to give birth. There's also time to die. This is the full span of man's existence. You're born, or you're given birth, and then you die. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. Certainly there is the parallel of giving birth and dying. But within the context of within that life, and especially in Solomon's time, what is the means by which we sustain ourselves in this life? Well, food, right? And this is part of what he's describing. And certainly there is a sense in which there's an overarching kind of metaphorical application to it. Okay, but from a literal perspective, there's a time to plant. Okay, there's a time to planting season, and there's harvest season. All right, and that is the natural cycle of the seasons that God has established in this world. So there's a time in which it's important to plant. Certain seeds have certain ideal months or weather conditions that make it perfect to plant. Certain areas of land which is perfect to be planted. Soybeans need lots of water. Others don't need so much. And there's a time where some of those plants are harvested in the summer. There's other times where they're harvested at other times. But it's the idea of this consistent process, and that's what we're going to notice. There's not a single thing on this list that has only ever happened once. And for that matter, there's probably not a single thing on this list that we don't experience more than once in our own lives. I mean, certainly not being born, we're only born once, but to give birth, okay, even if we are, I'm not a woman, but even if we ourselves aren't giving birth, but we are certainly associated with other people who give birth, this is going to happen more than once in our experience of life. Noah?
It helps me in this passage, not that I get it all, to focus on the word season, a longer span, because I think every time we this time, especially in our, we think with the digital, it's 8:34, it's some very specific, but that's not what he's talking about. A flow of events.
Right.
A longer span when this happens, but then it changes and this happens, this changes.
Sure, absolutely. And in these first two examples, you think of our life as a season, okay? A season comes and goes, and what follows, for instance, winter? What's coming? Spring. And then, you go, in Texas, it's go straight to summer, right? But the idea is that there's consistently another season coming, okay? And that carries with it the idea that Solomon's already established. One generation comes, it dies, and another generation comes along. It is this consistent cycle. It is this consistent seasons that man goes through. And so within this life, within this cycle, this is what man experiences. A time to kill, I always get this kill and heal, time to kill and a time to heal. He's not in any way suggesting, he's going to talk about war and stuff here in a little while also, but the idea of a time to kill and a time to heal, this happens within man's existence. He's not speaking to saying it's okay to kill or something like that, and more specifically, what we would term it not being okay to murder, okay? But the idea of a time to kill, this is part of man's existence. Since Cain and Abel, man, there has been, every season of man, there has been occasions in which man has killed. That includes wars, that includes anger, moments of anger between two individuals. That's part of life. That happens. He's not saying that God excuses it or that it's okay to do it. He's saying that this is what part of man's existence is. There's a time to kill. Okay, there's a time in which sometimes that may be necessary, and certainly outside of even man to man, okay, or human being to human being, there's times in which we kill other things for different reasons, and as a result, there's a time to heal, which is to say, in the broader context of what he's describing, there is a time for anger. There's a time for hostility. But there's also a time for peace. It's kind of the sense. And he's going to deal with that here in a little while anyway. But the terms that he uses here are consistent with the idea of man's experience. And this is part of what man experiences in this life. All right, continuing with verse 3. A time to break down and a time to build up. Especially in context of Solomon's time, certainly one of the things that they would have broken down or builded up would have been old ruins. Okay, you think about a lot of the Roman statues and aqueducts and buildings that they built, how over the generations, over the centuries, those things were torn down in order to take that material to build something else. And which is why a lot of ruins that once existed, we don't have anymore, because just the natural course of time. People, it was built and it was beautiful and it was splendid, and then all of a sudden, well, there's a need for us to build a house here, and these stones aren't doing anybody any good, so I'm going to take them and use them to build a house. That's part of what he describes here, is that there's a time to break down, there's a time to tear down what someone else has built. You can use that literally and symbolically or metaphorically to describe this sense in which sometimes there's a time in which it's necessary to tear down something someone has done. to undo what someone did. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily a wrong thing. Just like a time to kill. That's not necessarily a sinful thing. Sometimes it's necessary within our lives for that to take place. This isn't some sense of condemnation of the event itself. It's simply a part of what takes place. And a time to build up. Things that have been established, things that have been built, to build up something that has been established already, or to build something completely new with what has been built before. Yes, sir?
I can't help but think of the time to break down, time to build up, not even just in the sense of what you're saying, like infrastructure and buildings, but people themselves, using the analogy of being in the military. You always hear about, young men and women coming into the military. We break them down to build them up.
Right.
Like you were saying, doing away with what is no longer needed, like maybe beliefs, personalities, and whatnot. So relating that to being a Christian, you bring someone new into the church, you might need to break down some old habits, some old way of thinking to build them up to a new way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Coaches of sports teams, a lot of times they have to undo the lessons learned by through high school coaches and other stages of a young person's life to teach them more properly or accurately a technique or some ways of doing things. So certainly from a broader symbolic or metaphorical point of view, just as Troy said, time to break down and build up outside of just the physical building sense. There's a lot of that we experience as well. Yeah. Anything else to verse 3? Verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Some of these, verse, and really to a certain extent, verse 3, you kind of have a parallel between kill and break down. Then you have heal and build up. Okay, and again, very distinct comparisons, but at the same time, they are related. Okay, from the perspective of things increasing and growing versus things decreasing or dying to a certain extent. And then verse 4 then, when he says time to weep, weeping and mourning, those are pretty much synonymous. They're pretty much the same. To weep, to mourn. There's sorrow involved. Then a time to laugh and a time to dance. Keep in mind, especially from Old Testament all the way through, and even to a certain extent in certain cultures in the New Testament, dancing was a very ceremonial process. Okay, there was always a purpose. You think about Miriam in Exodus, where she led the women of Israel in a dance to God to celebrate the victory over the Egyptians that God had brought. There were other times we see dancing not being specifically wrong in the context of what they were doing ceremonial. Okay, it's not like our dancing. A lot of times we see things in a 21st century lens. It's not the same thing. So what he's describing is associated to laughing or a time of joy, a time of things are good, things are at peace, celebration. Okay, just like what Miriam and the women of Israel did in Exodus. And so this process of, in our lives, have you ever wept? I don't think there's anybody in here, guys, don't lie. All of us at some point have wept, haven't we? I'm sure we have. Have we all mourned? Have all of us at some point lost someone we loved or cared about? Okay, that is part of the human experience. Later, Solomon's going to say, it is better to go to the house of mourning to the house of laughter. Okay, because it reminds us that we're mortal. But then he compares that to the time that we laugh, the time that we celebrate, and that we have joy. That both things go hand in hand in this life. All right, we'll pick up here in verse 4 next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.